Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Sharing with Shellshock. I am your host, ShellshockPrime, and right now we are here with another episode. And this week we're going to be doing Sega Genesis. Genesis does. Tonight we got two guests, both of which are returning to this podcast. So, first things first, we got Rick from D-Pad. Hello.
Hello. Hi there.
Good to see you. Welcome back.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
Yeah. And Soan, we've had you for the first season, but you're back now. Welcome back.
Indeed, I am. Hello.
Yes, it's good to have the both of you on. We're going to be talking about Sega Genesis, and we're going to be talking a lot about that tonight. But first, what type of content do you do, Rick?
Oh boy, we do a little bit of everything. We've been on YouTube for about 13 years now. Our big claim to fame, our big thing is franchise plays. We'll take a whole franchise, we'll do it soup to nuts, top to bottom, every game in the series, kind of both as a chance to see how the franchise has grown and also to try to investigate how the company and the franchise has sort of changed, I guess, over time. Like what has happened to kind of form it into what it is now versus what it was 30 years ago, for example.
Yep.
We've done Mega Man, we've done Zelda, we're doing Sonic, Kirby, Kingdom Hearts, Resident Evil. Trying to think if I've left any out. I might have missed one, but yeah, we do it all. Sonic is one we're gonna be doing for another probably 6 years. We've been doing it since 2016, and we're absolutely nowhere near done. So
yeah, yeah, that's a lot of content right there. Very good. What about you, Soan?
Currently, I'm about to finish up the Sega Genesis marathon I've been doing for 3 years now. 5 games left. That's on Mondays. On Fridays, I do whatever I want, like difficult games or whatever I feel like.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much what I do.
All right, sounds very good. All right, so before we get started, I do want to talk about the Sega Genesis real quick about how it all began. So prior to the Sega Genesis, Sega had a console called the Sega Master System. And while it did not do well in Japan or in the United States, it did decently well in Europe as well as Latin America. Especially where in Latin America, they still make games for the Sega Master System to this very day, which is wild when you think about it. So in 1988 in Japan, Sega decided to create a new console, this time in 16-bit, known as the Sega Mega Drive, which will release in North America and Europe a year later. Granted, we are the only region to have it known as the Sega Genesis, while everywhere else in the world is Mega Drive. Why is that? Apparently some sort of trademark issue. But so the Sega Genesis launched in North America on August 14th. 1989, and Altered Beast was a packing game. And it would remain a packing game until June 23rd, 1991, when a famous little hedgehog came in, Sonic the Hedgehog. And the rest, as they may say, is history. And now we have the Sega Genesis, been around for about 35 years in North America. In the fact that it's left a lasting impact for so many years. It's just amazing how we had the Sega Genesis, so many different games. It was the console that managed to knock a decent amount of market share off of Nintendo, because Nintendo had a major market share within the mid to late 80s going into the early 90s. And Nintendo ended up just having this first sense of competition. So, fun fact, Sega Genesis, or the Mega Drive in Japan, bombed. But in North America and Europe, those are the main markets that they were focusing on. Because while the Super Nintendo dominated, or Super Famicom dominated Japan, second place was the TurboGrafx-16, which did well over there, but not so much everywhere else. So, today we're going to be talking about the Sega Genesis, and we're going to get started with, we will be talking about our earliest memories of the Sega Genesis, including when we first got one. So, Rick, let's start with you. when did you first get a Genesis, and what memories do you have for the Genesis that you could easily remember?
So growing up for a while, I'm the oldest of two siblings. I got a younger sister, 3-4 years younger, and so when the Genesis came out, I was 2 years old, like video games were not really like my parents bought an NES for themselves that I then wound up getting like super obsessed with. And for a while they were like, oh, we're not going to get like more of these. There's a bunch of these game consoles that are out. But a couple of my friends, as I was getting a little bit older, was like, oh, they got a Sega Genesis. It's pretty cool. And I like begged them for it. I was like, I really wanted it. It's so fast, it's so cool. There's all this stuff going on, and I don't remember what year I finally managed to convince them to get me one, but I still have. I hope I get it in shot here. Yeah, there we go. This is my mom's handwriting on my original Sonic 1 cartridge that we got with the system, and I fell in love with it completely. I wound up staying mostly a Nintendo fan, but the Genesis in particular just really spoke to me in a big way, and I loved so many of the games that were on there. It's kind of funny that like the other Sonic games I love substantially more than Sonic 1, but I don't know, it was a classic. I got a bunch of games for it that I really loved, including some that like nobody else seems to know exists. So it's always interesting to just kind of be like, oh yeah, I used to play a lot of Dynamite Heady, and someone's like, I don't even know what the hell you're talking about. It's like, oh well, all right, bummer.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a great system, so many memories, and yeah, we're 33. We're about to be 33 years into Sonic as well. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Soan?
That's a funny story. It started off at a birthday party. My mom was getting it for me. The problem was she put it in like the basement, which was really freezing cold, and she didn't understand electronics break after it. So when we started trying to play the game, we didn't have a Sega Genesis on my birthday party. So, but the game that came with it was Sonic Spinball.
Ooh.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah,
nice.
Oh wow.
yep. I do enjoy Sonic Spinball though. I really do.
Yeah.
I feel
So
like it's like a roller coaster game. There's like a lot of high points and a lot of low points, and it just whiplash back and forth between.
Yeah,
yeah, it's not
I
a bad
did
game.
beat-
It's decent.
I did beat Sonic Spinball on original hardware and my marathon. So
Nice.
yeah,
Hell yeah.
Yeah. So in regards to Sonic the Hedgehog, or rather Sega Genesis, I'll get to Sonic in a minute, but my first memory was this was way before Sonic was even announced. My uncle, one of my uncles had a Sega Genesis because I was dropped off at his place because I remember my mom had to go somewhere with my dad, and I think they had to take my brother somewhere. I don't remember what it was. So what I remember was one of my uncles. He was watching over me just to make sure that I was okay. He had a Sega Genesis. I played it for a bit. It wasn't my first console. The NES was my first, but this was like sometime way after I first got an NES. So I played it. I don't remember what the game was. It was like some sort of game that you were on a boat, but I don't remember what game this was. So unfortunately, it was like this was like in 1990 or 1991, and then the next
On
time
the Genesis, or
it was Genesis. I just don't remember what
Yeah.
game it was, but I remember in 90, like later in 91, I was seeing commercials for Sonic the Hedgehog. What I remember was that there was this woman who happened to be a part of some sort of organization known as HAG, and she was talking about how Sonic the Hedgehog was not a good like influence.
oh, I remember that.
And you see Sonic in the picture, and he was like he was moving and everything, wondering like what exactly was going on. Like just not liking the conversation. They were showing gameplay of Sonic the Hedgehog, and then the moment she said, "Why couldn't she be more like that nice one, Mario?" And then he basically just stuck out his tongue and just sped through. And she was like, "Little brat." And then that was when they showed Sonic the Hedgehog. That, and there was another commercial that was out around the same time. Well, a few months later, when the Super Nintendo came out, there was a commercial where there was this salesman, like someone was walking in because they were going to buy a game and a system, and you see two
The two
TVs
TVs.
side by
Yeah.
side, one that had
This
a
one's a
Super
classic.
one that had a Super Nintendo with Super Mario World, and the other a Sega Genesis with Sonic the Hedgehog. They were trying to persuade the person to buy a Super Nintendo with Super Mario World, and the kid was like, "No, I want a Sega Genesis," and it costs a lot less. And he ended up going for it, like much to the chagrin of the salesman. Because I
That
remember,
got parodied so many times, though.
yes, it has. What I also remember was when I've watched these commercials and then like I would see ads for so many years for different Sonic games. Like in '92, we get Sonic 2, like the
The
main,
wiping up the couch with the game box.
yeah, the infomercial was easily like one of my favorite commercials for Sonic I've ever
So
seen.
good.
Like, um, but I first got a Sega Genesis back in Christmas Day of 1993. Like my parents were, because we were not able to go on like a big trip, like to go to Florida or whatever for like Universal or Disney. So my parents were only able to afford one home console at the time that was brand new. It was either a Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo. And the reason I went with Sega Genesis first is because there were two Sonic TV shows at the time back in '93. On Monday through Fridays, there was Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, which was more comedic. You had Sonic and Tails, you had Dr. Robotnik, Scratch and Grounder. And the thing about that show was it was a lot lighthearted. It was fun. It was
Very Looney Tunes.
yeah, something I would watch every day before school. And then Saturday mornings on ABC, there was Sonic Satam, or just Sonic the Hedgehog. And that show I remember watching, that was a lot more serious in comparison. It was a lot more dark, had the Freedom
Mhm.
Fighters, it had a different version of Robotnik, played by Jim Cummings. Um,
Yeah.
you still had Tails,
Legendary portrayal.
Oh
but you had
man.
like a lot of other characters. That show had two seasons. It's a shame that they never got a chance to do a season three, which we probably would have got Knuckles in that show.
There is,
Actually,
if you've, I don't know if you've heard about it, but there is a fan project right now that is doing a season
season
3.
3, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
It's looking sick.
I have to check it out.
I think the creator actually released notes of what he was gonna do with season 3.
Hmm.
So I don't know if the people doing that season 3 are using those same notes, but yeah.
I think Snively was supposed to be like the big bad of that season, I think.
Yeah,
Because like
and
something happens to Robotnik
And
at the end of the season, and he's supposed to like be the new.
and
right,
yeah,
and Nagas.
Ixis Nagas was
Yeah,
supposed to
yeah.
come
Yeah.
in. We the plot was that Sally was supposed to fall in love with somebody else, which more likely that somebody else would have actually been Knuckles. Knuckles
Oh,
would have came
interesting.
in. I don't know if they would have brought Amy to the show or Metal Sonic because I think they probably would have tied in Sonic CD in some way.
Hmm.
Um, I think they would have put Metal Sonic in at some point as like a foil to Sonic. That would have been interesting. I don't know what directions they would have went with, but they probably would have added some more characters from the comics, like the Archie comics at the time, into the show. Um, but those two shows were pretty much the driving force for me getting a Genesis before I got a Super Nintendo. I did get a Super Nintendo eventually, and personally, I love it a lot. But the Sega Genesis I got first, and
Same here.
I spent so much time on the Genesis for so many years. Um, and the first game that I got with it was Sonic the Hedgehog 3, but it only came with one controller. So we had to wait a little while just to get another controller just so we could be able to play two players. Um, and thanks to the Sega Genesis, Sonic 3 was the very first game that I ever got day one. I had to beg my parents because usually if I were to ever get a video game, it would either be like on Christmas or my birthday. Um, but in this case, I just said that I wanted this game badly. I really wanted this game, and and we got it day one. And because I remember seeing so many commercials at the time for McDonald's, when they had the McDonald's Happy Meal toys for Sonic the Hedgehog 3. I remember that and just seeing this like gameplay what they were in Marble Garden Zone, and I'm like, oh my god, I want this game now. I was like 7 years old at the time, and I was in school just drawing pictures of Sonic, just anticipating Sonic 3, and I had no idea what else to expect because I was already playing Sonic 2 around this time. So when I was playing Sonic 3, like it was obviously like the introduction to the character Knuckles, because Sonic 2 had Tails, the Sonic CD had Amy and Metal Sonic, so Knuckles made his debut here. Um, I've gotten some other games as well. I've got Quackshot with Donald Duck, Castle of Illusion with Mickey Mouse. Um, what else did I get like around this time? I remember my cousin would always come over and bringing in like different games at least like every time he would show up, just to show us what type of games that he was playing and introduce us to some games. And I got into a lot of games thanks to my cousin. Um, he was older. He was much way better at video games than I was. Like I remember at the time it was like whenever I would see him play games and he was so good at them, I was like, oh my god, my cousin's so good. I wish I was like him. And at the time it was like someone that, because he was much older than me, so I looked up to him in a sense where I would see how good he was at these games. I'm like, I just wish I could do that. And my brother was the same way as well. So I remember like just playing through these games, but when Sonic 3, like when I played it, I remember I had to wait until when he came over because there was a level that I was stuck at for days until he finally showed up during the weekend. And that level was Carnival Night, because Act 2, the barrel. The
The Barrel of
barrel,
Doom.
because at the time we didn't know what to do. Even he didn't know what to do, but managed to figure it out by pressing like up and down. Like just quickly press up and down just to be able to get through.
I remember playing that level and I accidentally went through it somehow, but then after a while I was like, how did I do that? I don't remember.
And
I
then
managed to do it while jumping exactly once. I've never been able to replicate it.
I remember like I watched my cousin beat the rest of the game, and then like it ended at launch base, and I was happy to see the ending, but at the time it's like I had no idea that that was not where the game was supposed to end, and little did I know. And then I remember I was reading up a magazine. I think it was Game Informer back in '94. We had a subscription to Game Informer in '94, and I remember seeing a level select code for Sonic 3, which at the time I couldn't pull it off. It's still hard to pull off right now. It's like one of the most like difficult codes to pull off.
It's like 12 inputs in about a second and a half. It's super fast.
And yeah, and the moment you get it, you hear a ring. You hear the ring sound. And when you go into the level select, you see it says Mushroom Valley. Not Mushroom Hill, but Mushroom Valley. That was the original name for it. Flying Battery and Sandopolis. And Flying Battery was originally supposed to take place after Carnival Night, but before Ice Cap. But because that, as well as Mushroom Hill and Sandopolis, were cut from the game due to time constraints, because I was wondering what's with all these extra levels, because I was like, because at the time I didn't know like that there was going to be more levels. I thought that you could select them, but you couldn't. They were cut. So what happened was that the reason that those levels were cut, as well as the ones that we're going to work on, like Death Egg, Sky Sanctuary, and all that stuff, is because when they split the game in half, it's all because of the fact that they had a promotional deal with McDonald's for the Happy Meals. Because if they would have delayed the game, and if they would have delayed the promotion for McDonald's would have pieced out. So there was that. So what I remember, like, I had to wait until October. Well, actually, no, not even October. Like, October is when Sonic and Knuckles came out, but I didn't get that game until Christmas. And I was lucky to actually open it Christmas Eve. Like, I was begging my mom to let me open it. She was like, no, you gotta wait one more day. Wait one more day. And then, like, we had family coming over, and I was like, I had to play it. I couldn't wait. My mom was like, okay, here. So,
You're fine, take it, just go.
and then I locked on with Sonic 3, and then it automatically said stage 7, which was the Mushroom Hill Zone, and then we just played it, and I was like, wait, where are these emeralds going? And then we got more special stages. We got a lot more stages. I'm like, wait, Flying Battery? I remember seeing this in the magazine. Like, I remember reading about this, and I was just like, just playing these stages. managed to beat the game in like after a few days. Like I think either Christmas Day or the day after Christmas, I beat the game because I remember like struggling just to get through the Death Egg Zone, and Sky Sanctuary Zone was just a sight to see. I will say though, the first time I've beaten Sonic and Knuckles, or at least the Sonic and Knuckles stages, and just seeing the actual ending, I just kept playing Sonic 3 a lot. Like, because especially since I was on Christmas break around this time, I could not get enough of Sonic and Knuckles. And I spent so much time, so many years playing Sega Genesis games until 97 when I got a Sega Saturn. And that one, that's another story. That's going to be another topic for sharing with Shellshock. But yeah, but Sega Genesis I spent so much time on. So those are some of my earliest memories, like 90, late 93 to 94, in regards to the Sega Genesis. Uh, and I will say though that I love the Sega Genesis. So that's the first thing. So we're not doing community questions yet. So Noble Boy, we haven't answered your question yet. We will be at the end of the stream. But it was basically talking about our memories with the Sega Genesis and like when we first got one. So now let's talk about our favorite Sega Genesis games of all time. 5 at the very most for each of us. We'll start with you, Soan.
Oh boy.
Like it does. It
Well,
does.
since I started playing the Sega Genesis Marathon, there's a few games that recently I enjoyed, but I don't know if they're my favorite or anything. Hold on a second. I did prepare for this. Give me a second.
Sure. Take your time.
Okay. Well, Sonic 3 and Knuckles would be one of them.
Yeah.
Gunstar Heroes is great. What else we got? Just looking through a list. Rocket Knight Adventures, that's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. And this game I kind of enjoy a lot. It's one of the first roguelikes, Fatal Labyrinth.
Fatal Labyrinth. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll add one more, Phantasy Star 4.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yes.
All right.
Shining Force, yeah, that's great.
Yeah, Shining Force is also really good.
So my favorite Shining Force was on the Game Gear. The hardest thing looking through the list of games is like, all right, I like this game, but I like the Game Gear version a little better for one reason or another.
Yeah. So, what about you, Rick? If you could come up with top 5.
Yeah. So I'm going to not include any Sonic games for this one because it would just fill the entire list. I think my top 5 outside of Sonic, in no particular order, Dynamite Headdy and Gunstar Heroes, 2 excellent games by Treasure. For a long time, I've wanted to do like a series on the channel that is, I've been calling it in my head the Treasure Trio or the Treasure Trilogy. Nice. For Dynamite Headdy, Gunstar Heroes, and Mischief Makers on the N64.
Oh God, Mischief
3, right? Super creative, little wacky, quirky games. I would also say, I would honestly say Rystar is probably up there as well, or Rystar. I think there was I want to say that was a Sega Technical Institute game, or the precursor to modern Sonic Team.
I think Naka was working on that one.
Yeah, maybe that's what it was. It's got just fun, quirky energy. There's a lot of momentum going on, not so much speed, but like momentum is kind of a big thing for Rystar. Wonder Boy and Monster World is one. I love the Wonder Boy and Monster World games. That one is.
I forgot to add that one to the list.
Oh, it's so good. Yes, here we go. Another one with my mom's handwriting.
Nice.
I adore this game. It was like the second game I ever streamed. Just because I love this game, and it's just an easy thing to play for like 5 hours and have a good time.
Mm-hmm.
And the last one I would say outside of Sonic is. So this one's weird. Tiny Toon Adventures: Buster's Hidden Treasure on the Genesis.
Oh,
it's a really charming game, and it starts. It's one that like starts soft enough that you don't have to be like in the mood for like a super challenging game as you're getting started, but it does amp up the difficulty a lot as you get into it. So it's got a really like sweeping difficulty curve that's like really enjoyable. Music is great, controls awesome. And yeah, I would say those are probably my five. I had Mega Man: The Wily Wars as kind of an alternate, but I like the originals better generally than the
They
Wily
are
Wars
actually better.
compilation.
Same.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, same
But-
here.
but as ports go, pretty decent port of all three of those. Plus, you get the Wily Tower, which is kind of nice.
Yeah. Let's see here. In terms of my favorite games, let's see. I'm not gonna go with any Sonic games because I know for a fact that I would have at least two of them in my top five, and that's Sonic 3 and Knuckles and Sonic the Hedgehog 2. But but I will say though that if I had to think of five games, Strider's one of them. I love Strider on the Genesis. Really good, really good arcade port. In my personal opinion, that's number one. Number two,
That one is hard too.
it's a very hard game, but it's really fun. Especially towards the end of the game, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of hard, but it's really fun. Um, Number two, I'm gonna go with Rocket Knight Adventures. That game
nice.
was great. It's um not exactly like Sonic in a sense, but it was doing its own thing because Konami wanted to make their own character that was inspired by Sonic, but didn't have that type of gameplay, but it was still fast in its own right.
You
I-
picking up the collection?
Yes, I will be picking it up once it comes out. It's coming out next week too, so I'll pick it up. Aside from that, I've spent so much time on that game. Though I've never beaten the final level. Every time I beat the final level, like it was just frustratingly hard. But I did watch my cousin beat that level, and I remember just seeing the ending from there. Um, Number three for me will be Streets of Rage 2. That one that's easily like one of the best beat 'em ups of the 90s, and it's up there as one of the best games of all time for me. Like of the Streets of Rage games, if I had to choose one, if I only ever had to own one of them on the Genesis, that's the one I would own too. Like one's okay, it's decent, but two is way better, and three is pretty disappointing. Less said about that one, the better. But Streets of Rage 2 is fantastic. My main in all three games is Blaze, but I just can't get enough of playing Streets of Rage 2. Let's see. Number four for me would be if I had to think of another one, Shinobi 3 is another one. Like there's other Shinobi games, like there's Revenge of Shinobi and Shadow Dancer, but Shinobi 3 to me is easily the standout of the three. I felt that they've knocked that one out of the park. They took that game was supposed to come out a year earlier than what it did, and then they delayed that game because they were not happy with the quality of the game. So they took that and they reworked it, and oh man, they did a fantastic job. So Shinobi 3, they knocked that one out of the park like instantly. That's because while Revenge of Shinobi was a great game for what it was when it came out in '89, Shinobi 3 blows it out of the water. It absolutely does. And I think to me it's easily like up there as one of the best games on the Sega Genesis. And number five is the first Shining Force. I still have to play two, but
Shining is great.
Shining Force 1 was fantastic. Having to control all the characters here, you have because the funny thing is that for the Nintendo front, the Fire Emblem games never made it outside of Japan at that time, but Sega released Streets of Rage, Shining Force here, and those were like the introductions to strategy RPGs of that era, but for Genesis, and I thought they did well. The only thing is that I would have preferred like all the playable characters having their turn, then the enemies have their turn. I would have preferred that, but aside from that, I thought it was well done. I thought they did great with Shining Force. I still have to play Shining Force 2. I've heard that one is really good. So
Longer.
a lot longer. There's a lot more to
Yeah.
do there. So I will definitely be playing that as well. So, but yeah, like there's plenty of other Sega Genesis games that I did not list. There's like a lot more. Like for example, like I know like there's like the Mortal Kombat games, specifically Mortal Kombat 2, or Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 would be up there for me, or something like Street Fighter 2 Special Champion Edition would definitely be up there. Um, Ghouls and Ghosts would be another one. Like, and the funny thing is, Ghouls and Ghosts in the Sega Genesis is actually easier than the arcade game. Rystar, I agree with you on that one. Dynamite Heady's another one. Gunstar Heroes. That's if I had to have an honorable mention, Gunstar Heroes. Great game. Holy shit. What a great game. Funny thing is that since Treasure was actually comprised of people who used to work for Konami, they pitched that game to Konami in 1991, and Konami said
Oh.
no.
Huge whiff.
'Cause-
Huge whiff.
Because that team, they were the ones who were responsible for like the Simpsons arcade game. They were responsible for a couple of like lesser games that Konami did, and then they also made their last game was Axel A on the Super Nintendo. It was a shmup, and then they left Konami, and then they formed their own company, and they decided to work on Sega Genesis because they spent so many years working on Nintendo platforms, so they wanted to work on Sega with the vision that they had, and they were making two games at once. Like Sega agreed to Gunstar Heroes on one condition: they had to work on a licensed game, and the licensed game they were working on was a McDonald's Treasureland Adventure game, which they finished.
That was actually pretty good.
Yeah, I've heard. They finished that. They finished that first, but they did not want to release that till after Gunstar Heroes because they want Gunstar to be their debut game, which made sense. Road Rash was pretty good, but I was never really much of a sports guy, so I never really played too many sports games. The only sports game that I remember playing on Genesis was there was a World Championship Soccer 2, and then there was a boxing game that had Buster Douglas. Buster Douglas, for context, Buster Douglas was the boxer that beat Mike Tyson for the heavyweight championship in 1990. When Nintendo's license for Punch-Out expired, they've watched a match between Buster Douglas and Mike Tyson, and that was a huge upset. That actually reinforced their decision, and not like the allegations against Mike Tyson at the time, because he did a lot of really nasty things, but among many things. But Sega decided, you know what, we're gonna work on our own deal with Buster Douglas, so let's actually do that. And they also did a deal with Michael Jackson as well. Michael Jackson Moonwalker, they did that. They tend to, in their early days of the Genesis, get celebrities on board, whether if it's like major superstars from music, TV, movies, or sports, and they give them their own games, and as a way to boost Genesis sales, which it worked for a while, especially considering the fact that at the time, Nintendo didn't have a 16-bit console until 91. So they were ahead of the curve with that one. So they had like a 2-year head start over here, and it worked in their favor. So that was that. But yeah, so those are like some of the games that I would consider to be like the best games on Sega Genesis. I still need to get into the Phantasy Star games. I still need to get
Same, yeah.
I still need to get into like Beyond Oasis. I've heard great things about that.
Good game.
Another one I would Castlevania Bloodlines is great. I still have to finish Hard Corps. Like Contra Hard Corps, I have to do that. But Castlevania Bloodlines is great. To me, not as good as Rondo of Blood or Super Castlevania 4, but I think Bloodlines is really good on its own right.
I need to finish that one, Bloodlines.
Yes, and I'll bring up Mega Man, the Wily Wars real quick. And honestly, I will say though that they did fix one thing that the NES version of Mega Man 1 had, and that was there was a spike glitch where if you touch the spikes, even if you had iframes, you die. They did fix it here, but while they may have fixed that, it did have its own problems, but it's still worth playing. So if you have a Sega Genesis Mini, or if you have a Switch and you have NSO, you can play it on there. Um, but everyone is a fan of Dick Vitale's "It's Awesome, Baby." I blame Scott the Wasp for that one. Um, but yeah, so those I would pretty much say are the best games on Sega Genesis. Uh, I do want to throw in something. I want to ask you guys something about the Sega Genesis. What do you guys think about the campaigns they would do, like Genesis does, or blast processing and all that stuff? Rick, I'll go with you first.
I think they really, really captured the attitude of the like early '90s super, super well. It like they like the '90s. We had such a big like resurgence of like just kind of a countercultural vibe, and just sort of like again that like attitude, that kind of like tough, like what the whatever, yeah, whatever. We're gonna do all this stuff, and like Sega was absolutely like finger on the pulse with that. Nintendo, despite the fact that the Super Nintendo did ultimately like pretty soundly beat the Genesis in terms of sales. The Genesis absolutely like crushed it on advertising, in my opinion. Like Super Nintendo ads were fine, but they were always like felt like they were lacking a little something, and the Genesis ones were so in your face. There's a reason that the parody of video game ads in the '90s is almost universally Sega based. Sega CD is the big one that they really like lean in on with like the FMV video and all that stuff. And it's like sick. I love 80 by 32 pixels of video in the center of the screen. It's great. Yeah, no, I think the ad campaigns for the Genesis were awesome. Blast processing is an interesting one since it doesn't exist and it was just a fully made up thing that they just decided as a name for the sake of like a sales pitch. I think it'd be a hard thing to scoot by with nowadays, with like the way that like advertising regulations have gone since like '92 or whatever. But it definitely they made advertising fun. And when Nintendo tried to like catch up in that regard, I don't know if anybody that's watching whatever got Nintendo Power in like the mid '90s. They tried. The Game Boy Color ads tried to kind of catch up on like a lot of lost ground on that attitude. The Game Boy Color ones were usually fine, but they had a lot of big misses elsewhere. Nintendo decided their way to be edgy was like gross out humor,
Yeah,
in like a kind of disturbing way, and famously probably cost us Mother 3, because Earthbound sold abysmally poorly in the West, almost entirely due to the ad campaign of like, oh yeah, scratch and sniff Mr. Belch or whatever. And it's like, yeah, this game stinks. And it's like, all right, well then we're not going to buy it. That's stupid. Sega was smart enough to avoid stuff like that, I think, for the most part, and I think it worked out really well for them in the end.
yeah, because the attitude that they had, they were focusing on like what they were doing was trying to capture something more so for adults or teenagers, because Nintendo was more family friendly around this time, and while they
Mm-hmm.
still are, but back then they were even more family friendly than they are now. But Sega, like, they just wanted to have that whole like, um oh, you see, these are for kids. This is what makes you cool. The Sega Genesis is what makes you cool to have. This is for like, I don't want to say like this is for like real men or whatever, because that's more of like that's a term that's completely outdated in my personal opinion. But I do think that they were trying to go for something a lot edgier, and they just wanted to capitalize on the hype for it. What do you think about this whole thing, Soan?
Well, respectable on Blast Processing is kind of right. Uh, there was one thing about the Genesis that was a little bit better than the Super Nintendo, but that was about it. Uh, so going back to Noble Boy saying the Genesis does commercials, basically that was before Tom Kalinske came into the field.
Yeah,
He changed he took that, but he played with it more.
yeah,
I do remember Nintendo trying to fight back, but a little later, like around Donkey Kong Country era, with the Play It Loud series.
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that
Yep.
so that was a thing.
Oh, I'm
I,
gonna
I
get
think
into that.
I was gonna say, I think something that's really important to consider about Sega's like marketing in the '90s too was it almost feels in some ways like they kind of wanted to reboot themselves a little bit. I'm not super familiar with the Genesis like game and console sales for its first 2 years, but uh, for a couple of years before we had Sonic the Hedgehog, their mascot was Alex Kidd, a little cherubic little dude, just a little blonde kid, and it was just kind of like, okay, well, or I guess brunette, I forget, but like it's kind of like it's not a very like impactful sort of mascot, and kind of look like, oh, it's just this little baby kid. All right, whatever. And then you get Sonic the Hedgehog who comes out, and his whole thing is like, I'm so fucking cool.
Yeah.
Look at me. I'm gonna go kick that guy's ass because I'm too rad to not do it. And like I think they kind of decided to like swing with that as they're like, okay, Sonic is selling like hotcakes. Let's like tap into that energy and not the Alex Kidd thing. And just the immediate comparison of Super Nintendo as being like, it's for families, it's for little kids or whatever. Mario is a safe Mickey Mouse looking kind of guy, and it's like, all right, but Sonic is just too fucking rad to not like just be the coolest ever. And they were like, oh, this will work.
At one point, the Genesis did beat Super Nintendo. They had 51% of the market. So
Yeah.
before Nintendo actually tried to do something about that.
Mm-hmm.
They did, and like Sega was riding high, but they did fuck up a little bit. Which there was a question that was asked about that, and I'm gonna get into that when we answer the community questions. But I will say that for the marketing campaign, I really did think that Genesis does like they were just trying to respond, like saying like they were trying to say, oh, Nintendo, you still have this 8-bit system. We have the 16-bit system. So what are you gonna do about it? We're kicking your ass right now. And then Nintendo's like, okay, well, here we have the Super Nintendo. Yeah, your console's good and everything, but we know how to utilize our own colors rather than just having like you may have boast a lot of colors, like you have 256 versus our like pitiful small amount. Like I forgot how much. I think it's something like 52 to 56. They have way less colors in the color palette than the Super Nintendo did. However, they took advantage of that by utilizing what they had just to make the games look really nice. And the problem is that the Super Nintendo was more powerful than Genesis in every aspect, except for the speed CPU, which the Genesis had a higher amount. That's why they have blast processing.
Yep, they ran with that one.
They did.
And there was another campaign, Welcome to the Next Level.
Yeah, yep. That was around like Saturn time, I think, wasn't it? Or did they start that one earlier?
Yeah, started with Genesis.
Was it the Genesis?
A little
also?
earlier.
Nice.
It was Genesis, but it was going to the Saturn. So
yeah,
like, all right, here's the next step up. Let's go.
The other, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think something that gets overlooked a lot in Super Nintendo versus Genesis was, I mean, sound quality is always going to be kind of subjective thing, and I think that the Genesis Yamaha sound chip that they used, probably in a technical sense, was ultimately a better sound quality than the Super Nintendo, but in the same way that third parties just did not know how to use the Wii U gamepad in a way that was like impactful, it seemed like most game developers really did not know, outside of Sega themselves, did not really know how to take advantage of that sound chip in a way that they could on the Super Nintendo. I think one of the more famous examples is Doom. Listen to Doom on the Super Nintendo. You get that nice like thumping bass to it. It's a very clean sound, but it's got some energy to it. And then you listen to the 32X version, and it is the most sludgy, like blur, 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 and it's just like, oh, this sounds like fucking trash.
Oh yeah,
and I think that also probably had a pretty big impact on like the later stage of where things went there.
Well, I'm gonna bring something up. So there was like some sort of a sound system that Sega made specifically for the Western developers, because the Japanese developers, they had experience with that chip because they've, like those who worked on arcade games, they used a similar chip to that, so they have some experience. Like when you hear music from like Konami or Capcom, like they knew exactly how to make their games sound really good. They had that experience. They used a similar Yamaha chip. compared to the one that the Genesis had. I don't remember what was the one they used for the Western, what program that the Western developers use, but they kind of sound very similar to each other in a sense, where they have their own distinct style in comparison to how the Japanese were doing their stuff. Like when you listen to music from um, even some of the bad games that have great soundtracks, like Spider-Man and X-Men and Arcade's Revenge. Rest in peace to, I believe it was Jeff Folan, or is it Tim Folan? One of the two.
It was Jeff.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
Tim was like his brother or
Yeah.
something that
Yeah.
also played really good music.
Yes. Because when you listen to the music, it just sounds so good. It's like a bop. Like it just cannot get enough. Like a lot of these companies, they take advantage of music their own way, but the problem is that a lot of them sound very similar. But then there's some that just didn't know what they were doing. Like when you talked about Rick in regards to the 32X port of Doom, like it just did not sound well. And then when I would hear something like, for example, music from like all the sports games, they sound the same to me. But anything from Japanese companies, I know that they would take advantage of it better. So to me, I felt that they did a better job with the music than the Western companies did around that time. Um, what I also know is that for Sega Genesis as a whole, like with the campaigns that they had, um, I remember that there was this one time that there was this one commercial where they were pretty much at like talk like had kids like talking about the Sega Genesis. This was like in 91, 92, and they talked about how like um one kid said that um he loved the Sega Genesis. He talked about how he would not be caught dead with a Super Nintendo. Like they were basically just trying to get these kids to praise the Genesis and talk about how like it's so much better than the competition and everything. The way they did it, some of them were pretty obnoxious, and others were basically. I feel it was at that time where because they wanted to be cool because this was the cool system, whereas the Super Nintendo was family friendly. Classic tribalism. The thing, yeah, tribalism in gaming. I feel like that could be an episode of sharing with Shellshock I could do in the future because I have a lot to say on that, but not here though. But
The console wars of the '90s were pretty much. I would have to say they're probably the most brutal that they've ever actually been. It's gotten close a couple times with Sony and Microsoft, but like Nintendo, Sega were like vicious to one another. Like Sega having their entire "What Nintendo Don't" ad campaign. There was actually, when I was a kid, I don't know where it came from, but I got a VHS tape that was like, it was clearly meant for like marketing stuff. Like I don't know if it could have been meant for like Blockbuster for all I know, but it was like, here's a bunch of games that are coming out on Sega, and it opens with it opens with like two or three guys in this like dark warehouse. Like it looks like an 80s B movie, and they're in a warehouse, and they're like, yeah, you got him? All right, cool. Get him in there. Just shove him in. And they have like a little stuffed like doll that they're like with a bag on its head. And like, what is going on? And they put it up into a vice grip and pull the bag off, and it's a stuffed Mario.
yeah,
I've seen
And
this one.
They start torturing the Mario doll with a vice grip. It's like, what is this? This is unhinged. I've never seen anything even remotely like that since the 90s. Maybe for the better. Ultimately, I think the tribalism is like kind of pointless at this point, especially now that games are so trivially ported between one another and like exclusives are not really much of a thing anymore. But like, holy shit. Yeah, weird times.
yeah, like
I do believe that back then it was a better start because it made Nintendo do something because they didn't do a lot, you know.
They were sitting
yeah.
very comfortable
Yes,
for
that's
for like 10 years.
They
so
were-
that made them. Hey, we got to do something. So yeah,
yeah, they were kind of a bit complacent in that regard for a while. Like though Japan was different, but outside of Japan, especially in North America around that time, they had to respond, and they did. Like especially like when Nintendo had the Donkey Kong Country commercial, or they had those Play It Loud commercials. They had like this band called the Butthole Surfers performing one of their songs on there, and it's like the way they're doing it, it's like they were trying, they were trying to be a little bit more edgy, trying to cater towards like teens and all that around that time. Like they were trying, and I'll give them good effort for that, but obviously they couldn't really match what Sega was doing around that time. So yeah, like they could not really match that. As a result, they ended up just like having to deal with the gross out humor, like you mentioned, like you mentioned when they did the Earthbound Scratch and Sniff. One thing that I'll always bring up, and I'm gonna bring it up again when I talk about Super Nintendo in the next episode that I'm gonna do, the Yoshi's Island commercial.
Oh, I was just about to mention.
The
Go ahead.
Yeah, like the guy just kept eating and eating, and then he exploded.
Oh God, I don't know if I've seen that one.
I don't.
That's the worst commercial.
Oh,
my
no.
God.
I don't know for a fact if Sega ever did any gross out humor commercials. They might have, and I don't remember. But what I do remember is that Sega, yeah, they stole that from Monty Python. But I remember.
Oh, Mr. Creosote. Yeah,
Yes.
totally.
I remember that Sega had like these commercials where they would pretty much have like some weird settings. Like I remember um there was this one back in 1994 when they were doing a Sonic 3 commercial. It was Groundhog Day. And then all of a sudden a TV fell on the groundhog before the groundhog got a chance to see his shadow. And it says
They
Groundhog
dropped
Day,
it from an airplane.
Groundhog Day, more like Hedgehog Day. And they were advertising Sonic 3 because it came out on Groundhog Day that year, which was actually a good time to do that.
Oh yeah.
I remember that commercial. I remember this one commercial where there was this kid that was bullied by like a bunch of bullies in his school, and then he got a Sega Genesis with Streets of Rage 2, and he kept playing that, and that actually changed his attitude to so that the bullies were being bullied by him, and he just basically like the bullies bought him some cookies, and he was like just smacked the cookie tray, and he was like, "I said chocolate chip." But one of my favorites back then was they did two versions of this commercial, one in 92 and 193, with different lineups of games. It was during the holiday seasons of those years where there was this kid who got a Sega Genesis for Christmas, and then he was playing it, and all of a sudden, the doorbell rings, and it's one of his friends saying, I heard Matt got a Sega Genesis," and then they were playing a different game. They switched games. Then another kid said the same thing, play a different game. Then another kid comes in. They're playing, and then all of a sudden more kids come in, and then they got one more doorbell, and the mother was like, "Well, I guess one more is okay." Then she opened the door, she freaked out, and there was a lot of kids outside of the front door wanted to come in so that they could play the Sega Genesis. Now that like the main kid has one, and he was pretty much the coolest kid in the block. So because that like the 92, like they had Sonic 2 and that they had Castle of Illusion, no, World of Illusion with Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, Tasmania. I don't remember what the other game was that in that commercial, but I know in 83 they had Toe Jam and Earl, Panic and Funkatron, they had Sonic Spinball, Disney's Aladdin, among many other games. Like they had different lineups to say, oh, this is this year's lineup. These are the games you can get with your Genesis this holiday season and all that stuff. And speaking of holiday seasons with Sega Genesis commercials, I have to bring this one up. There was one where they had these two elves who were living the high life in a mansion, talking about how they used to work for Santa, and they pitched the idea of Sonic and Knuckles to Santa, and he pretty much laughed. So they sold that to Sega, and they ended up getting a lot of money. It was like, "Who's laughing now, fat man?" And then they were laughing. One of those elves was actually in the Sabrina the Teenage Witch sitcom.
Wow.
Oh shit.
Yes, he was.
Wow, that's cool.
That was a commercial that I remember, like Sonic and Knuckles. Like they basically did that for the holiday season.
They had it. That commercial had like 3 parts to it. It was like a storyline commercial.
Yeah, but I think there might have been some of them might have been lost media by that point. But I remember,
Yeah.
I remember how like there was so many different commercials over the years. Like I remember seeing Vector Man commercial where they had a contest where you could win $10,000. Um,
I miss those days. I miss the video game contest era. That was a fun time.
it was like being able to get a chance to win something actually felt like, even though like usually those instant one contests nobody really wins those. Usually like they
Yeah.
they just do it as a way to get you to buy these products. But sometimes you might win, but most of the time, like when they pick winners, is usually like relatives of the people who work for these
Yeah.
companies. Even though even though they keep saying on the dotted line that anyone who works for these companies are excluded, that's a lie.
Mm.
Don't believe in any of that.
Yeah.
Um, but it it was like they had like this era where these people who just wanted to be cool. They wanted to have like this video game console that was completely different from what the competition was delivering, because Nintendo was labeled as kid friendly or family friendly and all that. Sega wanted to be more cool, edgy, wanted to show how different they were compared to what Nintendo had. Yeah, sometimes they'll have some of the same games, but then there were some games in which that um the Nintendo version is censored, but it's not on Genesis, like Mortal Kombat.
I was
That
about to
actually
say,
that which actually led to Mortal Kombat on Genesis outselling the Super Nintendo version. Usually it's the other way around, but that was one of the rare exceptions. And what happened
That's the
was
only the
it's the
only reason was the blood. That's
because
it.
because the only way to get blood in the Sega Genesis is through a code, and the moment that you
mm-hmm.
input the code, then you have that. Ironically enough, the censored fatalities in Mortal Kombat 1 were actually cool on the Super Nintendo, but the censored ones on Sega Genesis, if you didn't do the code, are bad. They're awful. They're a lot worse. Like for example, like Johnny Cage, he just has a kick that just sends your opponent off the screen. That's it.
Ooh.
It
Hmm.
that's not good. Whereas I think that they kept the fatality that he had in the Super Nintendo version, but it just didn't have blood or gore, just knocked the head
Yeah.
off. But
I'm gonna have to test these because I don't think I've ever played the censored version of Genesis.
like for example, the Super Nintendo fatality for Sub Zero, it like both versions would take out the head rip if for Genesis if you don't have the code, but Super Nintendo took it out completely. Instead, in Super Nintendo, he freezes your opponent so many different times that he jumps and then just knocks the head, the whole body like just breaks. On Sega
Nice.
on Sega Genesis, I don't remember what it was that like what fatality it was on there that they censored. Because I know he had the head rip, but I forgot what they replaced it with. But that being said, I honestly feel like Genesis just felt so cool at the time, and it was one of those things where like the games were great, but just the era, just you can't really replicate it. But
I think Mortal Kombat 1 and the Genesis wound up being one of the initial cases that resulted in the ESRB as well.
yes, that and also Night Trap on Sega CD,
Yes. Oh
and
boy.
um
Which
and
they released recently.
yep. But before we do the community questions, I want to ask, how much has the Sega Genesis meant to you guys? We'll start with Soan.
Um, I video games. That's how I started playing. Outside of NES, though, it was my next system on down the line, and I I couldn't get into Sonic. I mean, I liked Sonic a lot, so that's why I added Genesis. But the later down the line, when Super Nintendo came out and Genesis at the same time, I would compare the games and buy sometimes get the Genesis version instead. So it meant a lot.
All right. What about you, Rick?
Oh boy, like it was always like a trick to try to figure out like what I wanted to do between. We eventually got a Super Nintendo. My mom had a daycare, so it was a very easy sell to be like, yeah, but then they can also play on it, and therefore it's fine. But so we had both of those, and like similarly, yeah, it was a lot of times like, okay, I'm interested in this game on the Super Nintendo. I'm interested in this game on the Genesis, and it always came down to like, all right, this one looks pretty cool. This one's, this series that I really like. And like, it was always an interesting like battle between those. But like, yeah, the Genesis has always, my memories of those early days of gaming, like it's not a perfect system. It's got a lot of flops on it, a lot of weird stuff. But like at the very least, NES versus Genesis, there was really never a question. Unless you're playing like one of the absolute all-time NES games, Genesis just crushed it 100% of the time. Versus the Super Nintendo, like similarly, if I wasn't playing a game that I was like super familiar with, like all right, I'm playing Mega Man, I'm playing Mario Kart, I'm playing Zelda, A Link to the Past, or something like that. Genesis generally was where I wound up leaning because it's like it always felt more active. It always felt more fun. The music, for the ones where they got it right, the music was like really, really nice. And like I always found that like on an average day, if I was picking between the two, the Genesis wound up being one that I knew that I could have more fun with. If so long as I didn't pick one of the like 3 or 4 duds that were in the collection there. I was so glad that the Genesis Mini happened and they did it twice, which was kind of wild too. I wasn't expecting them to do it again. And I honestly, it feels in so many ways, and I think this is partly because Sega bowed out of hardware, whereas Nintendo is still in it. Coming up on they just last year was I think 40 years in since the NES. I mean, they had the Game and Watch and the Color TV game even before those, but Genesis, I feel like it doesn't get enough love in the retro scene these days. It's very easy to get NES, Super Nintendo, N64 stuff through like Switch Online or just their various collections and things. And Sega tries, and even honestly, it's wild to see just how Nintendo and Sega, they are like super close these days. Essentially, immediately after Sega left the hardware industry, Nintendo was like, yeah, let's be buddies now, and they kind of constantly are working together. So it's nice to see that like Genesis lives on surprisingly on the Switch library pretty well.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
really good.
Yeah.
The Genesis library.
Same thing with Wii Virtual Console. Honestly, it was great I was very surprised when they started pulling Genesis TurboGrafx games onto Virtual Console, and like, yeah, I there's a part of me that aches for that time of like the Genesis, and like there are not enough games in my opinion that harken back to the Genesis specifically. I feel like there's a lot of Game Boy retro games. I think there's a lot of Super Nintendo retro games. There's not enough that really capture the energy, the very specific vibes of the Genesis. There's a few. You got your like Freedom Planets and stuff like that, but like more often than not, it leans elsewhere. And I want that like dynamism back. Like that's the big thing. Like nothing ever compared to the Genesis. Honestly, even like PS1 when they did their Pixel games, more often than not, the Genesis just felt poppier. I don't know. I always loved it.
Mm-hmm. Like for me, Sega Genesis just meant so much because while the NES was my introduction, Genesis was what shaped me into getting into video games, and I spent so many years on it, and I've absolutely loved playing games on it. Just like I would play video games on every other platform besides that, but Genesis was the first one to really shape me into being the type of person I am in terms of what games I like, what games I would get into, and with that, like I'm always forever grateful with how Sega handled the Sega Genesis. Granted, that they weren't perfect, they actually messed up in every now and then, but when they actually like for every low that they have for the Sega Genesis, there's a lot of highs, and those highs are high, very high up, and they did great with that. Um, I spent lots of time on like different Sonic games or trying out different games. Like this was also the time when I started renting games from Blockbuster. So like around that time, like I would rent games for Sega Genesis just to see what games I actually liked. And I would try different things to see what worked, what didn't work. Ultimately it was a good time to experiment, to try things out of my comfort zone. So Sega Genesis was definitely something that meant a whole lot to me over the years and still does.
Rentals helped.
They did. But now it's time for community questions, and we're going to start with
Woo.
Dragon. What do you think about the phrase Genesis does what Nintendo don't? And is there something about it that still rings true today, or was it all a complete joke? Like, it rings true in some areas, but it doesn't in others. Um, but it was just a marketing campaign. That's all it was at the end of the day. It was just a marketing campaign.
It is one of the more popular ones because it came out first.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I would say it's very accurate for the time. I think the assessment that Nintendo was for kids, for families in the early 90s was 100% spot on. They really didn't, because at the time, like, I mean, what, the 80s were kind of a point where video games went from being non-existent to a like novelty specifically for computer nerds to being a toy to being specifically a toy for little kids. And then like Sega kind of came in there, and they came from where Nintendo was more from like a toy background, literally. Sega came from an arcade background. Their whole thing was arcades, where that was teenagers, like back in the 70s into the 80s, and like they had a very different attitude about it coming in. And so when they got into hardware, SG-1000, the Master System, into the Genesis, they were like, let's bring our teen audience back. And like they were 100% accurate. Nintendo was not popular in the same way with teenagers as Sega was very quickly proven to be. I'd say nowadays that's kind of a moot point. I think Nintendo still has a reputation of being a more family friendly and younger audience in general, but in like, it's not untrue. Sony and Microsoft tend to go with more mature themes for their stuff generally, but at the same time, Nintendo has an exclusive license for Bayonetta 3. Like it's such a moot point. It's more about just public perception at this point.
yeah,
But in the 90s, totally dead on accurate, 100%.
yeah.
There was a few. Right now, Nintendo has a few things that are a little more mature than compared to what Sony's doing. So it's kind of funny they have the censorship, but that's another story.
That is. The next one's from Dari. What Genesis games do you want to see come back, and on what systems? Well, I know we're getting the Rocket Knight Adventures collection coming back. But there are some Sega Genesis games that either rarely get re-released or never get re-released. Like, I know that we got Mega Man: The Wily Wars on Genesis NSO, as well as the Sega Genesis Mini. But if Capcom ever did like a Mega Man Hidden Gems collection, that's where I would think that they would put the Wily Wars on that. As that alongside like the Game Gear Mega Man game. But yeah, but it's more Genesis right now. But yeah, that's where they would put that at. Additionally, I think that um I would personally like to see um I would like to see some of the Mortal Kombat games get re-released. Like if there were to be like a Ultimate Mortal Kombat collection that had Mortal Kombat's 1, 2, 3, and Ultimate 3, I would, in addition to the arcade versions, I would also include like all the ports from all the consoles, including Sega Genesis, just to have them all on there at once. So WB, NetherRealm, team up with Digital Eclipse, they can make that collection for you, and they'll put everything, create like a crypt or something that has like all bonus content, and there you go. So those are the ones I would bring up. So Mega Man: The Wily Wars in a Mega Man Hidden Gems collection or something, and Mortal Kombat. Those are my picks.
I wish they would release like a new Phantasy Star in the style of the original Phantasy Stars instead of online, which I don't mind online, but I just think that would have been a cool idea to go back and have that kind of story. And Shining Force, they need to bring back that, and yeah, those are the two ones that I would love to see.
Oh, and real quick, on both accounts, in terms of what platforms, because I want to just mention that everything, everything,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
all active modern platforms.
I think we're past a point where you couldn't do remakes or re-releases of these, and the Switch wouldn't be able to handle it as easily as the PS5 and the Xbox.
Yeah,
And if they can't, it's like I feel like we're missing the forest for the trees if we're making something that is too intense for the Switch somehow with these games that are not designed to really be appreciated in that way.
yeah.
Um,
But go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, for so I had Shining Force on my list as well as like. Oh, so ironically, the Game Gear games I played Shining Force 2: The Sword of Hagia, and I guess they re-released both Game Gear games as as Shining Force CD later on, or Shining Force Gaiden CD or something like that. And like so Shining Force already has a little experience with like re-releasing and remastering their stuff. The Treasure games, it would be great to have those come back. I think all of them are just like amazing, and just to have like a nice shiny port of those would be great.
Yeah.
A weird one out of pocket, the James Pond series, I think would be awesome to have to come back. They're all very weird and quirky and unique, all very difficult.
Was that an exclusive?
Uh,
James Bond?
the first few at least. I don't know if James Pond 3 was.
Okay.
I know I'm pretty sure 1 and 2. So
I do
one,
remember that.
yeah, 1 was the one where you play just as like the mud skipper underwater, and then 2 you play. It's essentially a James Bond and RoboCop parody together. It's very weird. You're in this like toy castle doing all this stuff, and the aquatic games as well. Should just because why the hell not? But Echo is another one that probably could do with some re-releases of various kinds. I would be remiss to ignore this one. Wonder Boy in Monster World. I already mentioned before, it might be my favorite game on the Genesis outside of Sonic, just in general. And it's like the only game in that entire franchise that has not gotten any kind of port like update thing. It got released on like 3 different systems under different names. One is Dynastic Hero and TurboGrafx, but like Monster World 4 got a remake recently. Wonder Boy 1 got a big remake like 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah. I think Monster Lair got something as well. I guess Monster Lair is almost kind of a remake of a part of Wonder Boy 2. It's a little weird, but like Wonder Boy Monster World is so fucking good, and it's shocking that it hasn't gotten a remake. The Dragon's Trap also got an excellent remake a couple years back by one person for the most part.
Yeah, that was a great remake. I played that and I enjoyed it. That was actually the first Wonder Boy game that I've actually played and beaten all the way through. Fantastic game. I highly recommend that one.
Absolutely.
I'll put it to my list.
Yep, it's on everything.
You will not be disappointed.
You would not be disappointed. It's on Switch, PlayStation, Xbox, and PC.
Oh.
You wouldn't be like that. It was from the same team, Lizard Cube, who work on Streets of Rage 4. But
nice. Okay.
But the guy who directed Wonder Boy did not direct Streets of Rage 4. But he just wanted to do a Wonder Boy remake. He loved the Dragon's Trap, so the fact that he managed to get that, his dream came true, and it worked. And honestly, like, if anybody wants to try that, go ahead.
Very similar. If you've played Wonder Boy and Monster World, very similar game. It's probably the closest any two of the games are in the whole franchise.
Yep. All right. So the next question. Let me take a look at that real quick. The next question is from Kyle Gamer. Between the Sega 32X and the Sega CD, which add-on did you like the best? Okay, this is going to be a very interesting one to do. So, let's dive deep into this. So the 32X and the Sega CD, for those who don't know, these were add-ons the Sega decided to work on to enhance the Sega Genesis experience. So the Sega CD was basically Sega Genesis games on a CD with better music, better sounds for the most part. And they also were known for having full motion videos. And that was both a benefit and a detriment. More so a detriment to them because of the type of games they had. For example, they would have FMV games like Night Trap, or if you want to have a FMV light gun game like Mad Dog McCree. And also, they had music video games like Crisscross and Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch Make Your Own Music Video. They did those games. They worked on those. They would also have Sega CD versions of some Sega Genesis games like Echo the Dolphin or Batman Returns. The difference is with Batman Returns, it's different because it actually has the Batmobile stages because they actually added Mode 7 to Sega CD because the Sega Genesis did not have that. So
Sonic CD had that too.
that's how Sonic CD would have
Yeah.
that. Sonic CD was definitely
For
up
its
there.
special stages, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is that Sonic CD was originally meant to be the same game as Sonic 2. They were going to be the same game. But what happened was, for Sega CD, they ended up going in two completely different directions because it was supposed to be all about the time travel theme, which Sonic 2 did not have. Like, they broke away from that, but Sonic CD still had it. So, with Sonic CD, the way they handled things is they had 7 different stages, each of which had 3 acts, and they had like a good future, bad future, or past, except for Act 3, which is only like good future or bad future because depending on what you've done in the first 2 acts, it reflects on the third act. So, for example, if you destroyed the capsules or collected the time stones, you get a good future. Otherwise, you're gonna get the bad future. But um, they had.
It also
Go ahead.
it also had 2 different soundtracks for in Europe and Japan had different than the US version.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the US version, notably, for the most part, super inferior. The Japanese and European one used the Sega CD to its fullest, used audio tracks off the CD itself. The American version used, I want to say, the present track that was the same across both games, and then for
Yes,
any other,
because
either the past or bad or good future, they did Genesis-based sound chip, like remixes, kind of the present theme. It was very awkward and strange.
yeah,
I did enjoy the US soundtrack, but I don't hate the Japanese one.
They're
They're
very
both
different
good.
vibes.
Yeah, they're different vibes, but I do enjoy the US one.
It's
yeah,
honestly super fascinating how much, like, you can almost make like this sphere that starts with Sonic 1 that is just all of these things that come away from, like, all right, Sonic 1 happens and Sega makes this decision, that decision, that decision, that decision, that, and it all circles back around to the ultimate destruction of Sega's hardware department. Because you've got Sonic 1 comes out, big success. They decide to do a sequel. They want to do it on the Genesis and on the CD, and they have similar ideas, but then there's this fracture between the American and the Japanese sides of things. So you've got the Japanese team working on Sonic CD while the American team led by Yuji Naka works on Sonic 2. And this continues to kind of like fracture over time until you get to the Sega Saturn and the 32X, which I'm sure we'll get into in a little bit. But like ultimately the 32X and the Saturn are being marketed at the exact same time on opposite shores.
Oh, that was
And they absolutely just devoured themselves while trying to make the next big thing. And the Dreamcast was a great system. Under normal circumstances, it would have done great, but they set up such a hostile environment for themselves. Like Sega specifically, like Sega's top brass specifically kept Sega of America and Sega of Japan from speaking to one another for like 3 years. And it just completely crushed the entire company in the end.
it did.
Dreamcast would have been amazing. Any other circumstances, it would, like, they would have been up against the PlayStation, no problem. But and it all kind of just starts with like Sonic 1 and Sonic CD and Sonic 2 and just like
Yep,
it's super fascinating.
it really is.
there is one Sega CD game that should be mentioned that's really good called Snatcher.
Oh yeah, from Hideo Kojima.
Yes, and it's the best version out of all his other versions of it.
Yes.
Nice.
But I will say, in regards to Sega CD versus 32X, which one I think is better, I'm gonna have to go with Sega CD. But the thing about it is the 32X. What were they thinking with that? Because here's the thing, the reason, because the thing with Sega CD, it says 32X, because Sega of America didn't want to wait for Sega Saturn. They didn't want to wait. They wanted something new, so they made the 32X, despite the fact that the Saturn was still going to come out. And there was going to be a Sega Neptune, which is a standalone 32X console, a 32-bit console, but that got canceled because the 32X failed. And the reason it failed is because broken promises from Sega to the devs. That's number one. Number two, there was a lot of devs that were like, why would we want to make these games for Sega 32X when we could make these games for Sega Saturn instead? And many of them ended up not working with Sega Saturn because of like burning bridges, and then they ended up jumping ship to PlayStation instead. So they would jump ship. Sega messed up so much. Many of which is not exactly Sega of America's fault. Some of it is because Sega of Japan really screwed Sega over so many times, like Sega of America. Like, but 32X, to me, there's just really not a lot of games to really justify it. Sega CD, you could make a case for a good amount. Like, it has a cult following. 32X just doesn't really have anywhere near that level. It just wasn't really that good. Like, and the sad thing is that Knuckles Chaotix is a game that is stuck in Sega 32X hell. It has never been re-released. And I don't know if Sega will ever re-release that game.
Never say never. So people have been requesting it.
Honestly, if you want the best possible Knuckles Chaotix experience, play Sonic Mania Plus. It is
yes.
1,000 times better than Knuckles Chaotix in just about every way. I have a huge gripe personally with the non-Genesis 90s Sonic platforming games. You got Sonic CD is okay, but the level design is fucking abysmal. It's super bad. Like there's so many interruptions to the flow. Like it could be a lot worse, but like there are so many times you'll be moving along, especially in a game where one of the main mechanics, time travel, you have to keep your momentum for like 3 or 4 seconds, something like that. But the platforming is designed in a way to just interrupt your momentum as often as possible, and it drives me nuts.
Yeah.
Stardust Speedway in particular, like it's the exact opposite issue. They want you to have momentum, but it's just moving in loops, random directions. It's a maze and it's moving. Knuckles Chaotix takes all of those problems an order of magnitude further. Just the most incomprehensible level layouts. Sometimes in one of them, I think it was the Techno Tower, one of them has a puzzle that you have to be figuring out at the same time, and they don't tell you this. They just have a giant image, a flashing image of what ultimately you figure out is a clock that's meant to indicate that you have to hit these buttons every so often or you will just automatically lose the level, essentially. But like no sense of direction to that one in the same way as any of the Genesis games. I don't think we're missing out by not having Chaotix get released. It should be, for at least for preservation purposes, in the same way as like Sonic 1 also kind of struggles, but it's more of a like, hey, we're kind of just trying this out. Sonic 2 and 3 get it a lot better.
Yeah.
But like Chaotix should get re-released just for the sake of having it there. If anything, I was surprised that Sonic Mania just ignored it altogether.
Yeah.
But Sonic Origins. Sonic Mania Plus definitely takes the few bits of Knuckles Chaotix that are solid and hangs on to those. The combi ring is solid. The like tag team kind of thing for that is fun too. But I don't think, and yeah, the 32X did not have a lot of games. It had about 30 in total. It's essentially Nintendo's Virtual Boy. And yeah, they absolutely a huge failure from within on all fronts, really. Sega of America, Sega of Japan, and the top brass all got shit so wrong with that. Not the least of which, too, is a Sega 32 Genesis with the CD and the 32X all combined. Extremely similar specs to what the Sega Saturn ultimately was, and what the Neptune would have been if it was released as a standalone as well. So they essentially had 2.5 identical consoles that they were trying to figure out how to market at the same time for like the same release window. They got released, 32X in America and the Saturn in Japan were released, I think, in the same week. Like just maddening levels of poor management on that front. And I would bring shame to my channel if I did not mention the absolute worst thing you can play on the 32X has to be Slam City with Scottie Pippen. It's unplayable. It's shocking. It's an FMV. You need both the Sega CD and the 32X.
Oh, I know what you're talking about now. Okay.
It's a 2-disc game that is an FMV basketball game with 4 players, like 4 characters you can play against. It is hot garbage. It's just terrible.
Trip Killer did a similar thing. It was 32X and Sega CD once. Or there was a version of it anyway.
It's The FMV games were terrible. Like almost universally, they were awful. Night Trap at least had like the novelty of how fucking weird it was.
Yeah.
But like everything else, we did a 32X series a couple of years back, and he literally I just modded my Genesis Mini to have 32X games on it, and every FMV game we came across, it was oh god, I want to say like Illumination Studios or something. There was some specific company that kept turning up, and every time Digital Pictures. Anytime you see the Digital Pictures logo, you're like, oh, we're in for some fucking shit. It's gonna be bad. And they universally, outside of Night Trap, the rest were all completely terrible.
They were.
For Sega CD, at least I can make a top 10 list. For 32X, I cannot at all. Nowhere close.
Yeah.
Shout out to Star Wars and Colibri. They might be the only two good games on the 32X.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, there's nothing about the 32X that was good. Right. So
Nope.
Maverick, like Private Maverick asks, what game got you hooked onto the Genesis at the time? Like pretty much anything Sonic for me.
Sonic 1. It's such an easy answer, but it's true. Like, it was fast in a way that video games weren't.
Yeah. So
Any Sonic game, it was a Sonic box, just like Halo was for Xbox.
yeah. So yeah, anything Sonic. Let's see. So Noble Boy asks, which Genesis games have your favorite OSTs? So besides Sonic, I'm gonna go with Rocket Knight Adventures. I'm gonna go with Streets of Rage 1, 2, not really 3, but definitely 1 and 2 have my favorite soundtracks on Genesis. Revenge of Shinobi and Shinobi 3 are up there for me. Like basically any Genesis games where they have club dancing of like the late 80s to the 90s,
Yes.
like the early 90s. Especially if they were composed by Yuzo Koshiro, one of the greatest composers of all time. Composed Streets of Rage, Revenge of Shinobi. He composed Beyond Oasis, among many other games, especially on the Sega Genesis alone. And then it's like you have like all these soundtracks. If they're like, there's some soundtracks where like I prefer the Super Nintendo version over the Genesis one, but there are a few exceptions. Like there's some that I prefer the Genesis version over the others. Like I know Earthworm Jim's one, but another, if I had to come up with that I think is better on Genesis, I'm like it's just a matter of preference. Like for me, some of the Mortal Kombat games sound better on Genesis than they do on Super Nintendo. Street Fighter, some tracks sound better, but some tracks sound better on Super Nintendo, but it just depends on what you like. But that's just me. What about you, Rick?
I would say, so I can give you my top 3 real quick is Dynamite Heady, which has a slew of like genre spanning tracks. They have like shoot 'em up tracks, they got adventure game tracks, they got some platforming style tracks, wide variety. They even have I think they got Swan Lake for the first boss battle. They have a weird variety there and it's awesome. Wonder Boy Monster World, the music of that franchise is awesome. Every game they try something new, they bring back old tracks a lot. They've got this ripping like electric guitar theme they use for the final castle, and it's fucking amazing. I love it every time. And Rystar, which it feels almost like cheating because it is so close to Sonic in terms of its like sound quality. It's like if Sonic Team made a Kirby game, is kind of what the soundtrack is for that. And they have this really nice like motif they use for that like that goes through the whole game. Really, really good. All 3 of those are unforgettable OSTs.
Yeah, I agree with Dynamite Heady as well. Like anything Treasure for that record.
I also have a top 3.
Mhm.
Sonic 3 and Knuckles, especially the ones that were censored in Origins. Yeah, Ice Cap, all those
got
other
half
ones.
an hour. I got a video for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Hold on. Ice Cap. I felt like the Ice Cap tracks weren't bad, as well as Launch Base Act 1 wasn't bad. Everything else, no. Carnival Night was the worst.
Oh,
Out of the prototype tracks.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
the one that was in the final game in on Origins. Ugh.
They launch base. I can appreciate launch base zone act 2 sounds to me like Chrome Gadget act 2. Very very similar vibes, and I kind of dig it. Most of the rest I'm just like, please no. And some of that's bias, some of that is I've played 30 years of the Jetsons and all the Brad Buxer, Michael Jackson stuff. But like, yeah, the Carnival Night Zone stuff like is just not good. Ice Cap Zone is like fine. The proto Ice Cap Zone ones are okay, but I can't get hard times out of my head. I just need it. I need the
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
same. I love that track so much. Yeah.
So the other two, Phantasy Star 4,
Okay.
especially Laughter, the boss theme, and Shining Force, both of them have really good soundtracks.
All right. Sounds good. Let's see. So, H Bomb and Friends asks, which model of the Genesis did you have? 2. The second one.
I had the first. I had the first one for that.
Yeah.
The
Well, the
first
little
one just
the little switch, the little vertical switch.
yes, with the headphones.
Yeah, the little headphone slider that I don't know. I was about to say I don't know anyone who used it, but I'm pretty sure my buddy John on the D-pad talked about that he used to actually plug his headphones in for that sometimes. It was shocking to know that anybody actually used that thing.
Yeah.
I did.
Because my one of my uncles had that model, the Genesis, but I had the second one since I got it in '93 because it was when they switched the box branding so that it had like that little red stripe in the left side of the box. It was when they were shifting to like a different era of the Genesis. So I had Model 2. I never owned the Model 1 Genesis. I would like to own one someday, just for novelty's sake. And also my Genesis does not work, so if I were to get a Model 1, it's just to make sure it works.
Yeah, mine was the Model 1.
All right.
And I hooked up the Sega CD with it. And that was fun to work with.
Yeah. Noble Boy also asks, Sonic 2 or Sonic 3 and Knuckles, which do you prefer the most? Actually, I kind of prefer Sonic 2 more. Like, it was my first Sonic game, so I've spent so much time. I've replayed that game way more than I did Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Even though Sonic 3 and Knuckles objectively is a better game, I prefer Sonic 2.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sonic 3 and Knuckles for me in general because it's a longer game and I prefer the special stages, blue spheres over the special stages of Sonic 2. I'm sorry.
It's fine.
Honestly, if they just had a different 7th special stage for Sonic 2, I think it would be a very different story in terms of the comparison there. But when you get to a point where it's like, okay, the rings are going to be just in random places, go. It's kind of like, okay, man, that's just mean. that's not necessary.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm in the Sonic 3 camp as well. Sonic 2, I like a lot. I like there are more levels in Sonic 2 that I dislike compared to Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Sonic 3 and Knuckles, yeah, I like the music better. I like the levels better. It's longer, and you have multiple paths you can do depending on your character, which was really rad. Getting Supersonic and then Hypersonic was like fucking crazy.
All the characters.
Yeah, it felt like a massive, epic game. Even by comparison to Sonic 2, which already was so much bigger than Sonic 1. But yeah, so three for me as well.
Yeah. So Mr. Ben asks, which game or series, in your personal opinion, is the most underrated or ignored from the Genesis library, and wish it had gotten more love and attention and or widespread exposure? If there's a Genesis game that I wish had more exposure to the point where more people talked about it and talked about how much they love that game, it's actually a treasure game that more people really need to play. Dynamite Heady. More people need to play that game. But I also say Rocket Knight Adventures. Please, more people should play that game too. The collection's coming out, so there's your chance. And if I had to come up with one more game to come up with for Genesis, that's underrated or ignored, I'm gonna have to go with the Acme All Stars Tiny Toon Adventures. It was a sports game that had Tiny Toon characters. It's better than that sports game that was on the Super Nintendo. That one was kind of weird. I like the Genesis one more. I had a lot more fun with that one. So those are my 3 picks. Rick?
Definitely echoing Dynamite Heady. It's criminal that I don't think it's been re-released literally ever, which is shocking to me. Like Gunstar Heroes had an actual series and it's gotten re-released once or twice. Dynamite Heady, nothing. And it's like, how? It's so good. So definitely Dynamite Heady. I would, part of me would love to say Rystar, but I feel like it's not that. It's probably a little underrated. It's maybe more that it's ignored. I think people don't really get into Rystar very much.
Yeah.
And they're really missing out. I already mentioned Wonder Boy and Monster World, which is fucking underappreciated and ignored by its own franchise, which kills me. For the sake of like throwing something that I haven't already, gushed about 100 times, I'll give you 2 options. One would be, and I don't know how much it comes up really, but Crusader of Senti, I think is one that's kind of
my
fun,
God.
Yes.
fun, rad one that needs more love. And also, you know what? If I had this question a year ago, I could answer with this. I don't think I can anymore. Kid Chameleon is one of the most absurdly difficult games I've ever played.
It is.
Literally like a week or 2 ago, I saw something about like either it's getting, I think it might be coming onto like Nintendo Switch Online or something.
I heard about that. Yeah.
It is so unbelievably difficult. I played, a friend of mine back in college was like, you got to play this game. You're good at games, right? I'm like, oh yeah. It's like, you got to play this Genesis game I got. It's so hard. And we played it. I played for like an hour and a half and barely was hanging on. And eventually I did die. And he was like, okay, cool. And I asked like, hey, how far did I get into it? And he's like, that's a kind of a hard question to answer with this game. I'm like, what the hell does that mean? For one, the levels are not done in a linear order. There's paths, weaving paths through the game level wise, but also we estimated by the end of it's like, I was like 25 to 30% of the way through after like an hour and a half of platforming. There's no saves, no continues. It is insane. And I would love for more people to experience how difficult that game is.
Yep. Soan?
I'm also gonna echo Dynamite Heady. I recently did play it and I did enjoy it, but it is a hard game. Another one would be I don't think anybody played it beyond me. Fatal Labyrinth. It
Fatal
is like
Labyrinth,
not a Dark Souls.
It's like a roguelike of sorts.
Roguelike. That's the word I was trying to. Yes, it's one of the first roguelikes, and I really enjoyed it. It's worth a shot. So those are my answers.
Okay. Next one would be from Minta Pie. Best and worst multiplayer game / memory on the system. Best multiplayer games on the Sega Genesis. Basically, if you're into fighting games, like if you play like any of the Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat games, my memory is spending so many days and nights with my brother playing like the Mortal Kombat games or the Street Fighter games on the Sega Genesis. Spent so much time put into that. Like, we loved playing Mortal Kombat. We loved playing Street Fighter. We've also played some weird fighting games that were otherwise like that otherwise could not stand toe to toe to Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat. Like some random games that no one remembers. And worst multiplayer games. You have games like Rise of the Robots, Balls 3D. I forgot. Rise of the Robots for Sega Genesis was canceled. Sorry, it was only on Super Nintendo. But
Might as well.
But Balls 3D for sure. That was on Genesis. That one sucked. Another multiplayer game that I thought sucked on the Sega Genesis. There was this one. I don't remember the name of it though. I have to look for it. But there was this one game that I remember trying to play. Like, it was like a random fighting game. I don't remember the name of it. It was like a long time ago. But the name is escaping me, and like the description, I'm trying to come up with it because there was like a bad multiplayer. But I do remember, that James Buster Douglas game that sucked too. It was a pretty mediocre at best boxing game. But yeah, best memories were playing Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter with my brother. I did not play Shaq Fu when I was a kid. I've actually played it on an emulator, both the Super Nintendo and the Genesis version. Neither version's good, but I would probably say the Genesis version is much worse. All right, Rick.
Let's see. As for the best, I would say I got 3 for this one. Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine.
Yes.
I'm a big fan of the old Puyo Puyo. And if you're familiar with that in that franchise in general, then there's no explanation needed. It's a fun ass puzzle game, very active. And it can swing back and forth in a moment's notice. It's beautiful. It's no Tetris Attack, but it's got the spirit. It's solid to go there.
Yeah.
One that's kind of not reaching in like maybe not, but like I feel like 3% of Genesis owners played this. I might have talked with one of you two about this game recently, but General Chaos is actually a kind of fun multiplayer game when you go into that mode. It's a really difficult and kind of clunky. It's like if you were trying to do an RTS with Lemmings controls. It's really bizarre. But as a multiplayer game, it's a good like couple minute long like rounds of like, all right, you got to pick your units, who you're gonna do. You got grenades. It's fun. It's a good time. And the third one is a pretty easy one, and it's embarrassing looking back at Genesis games and seeing something that does something so well that modern ones do so poorly. Sonic Superstars has maybe the worst multiplayer camera I've ever seen in a video game. By comparison, a game that absolutely nailed the multiplayer camera is Toe Jam and Earl, the original. It just goes, all right, let's keep it on the screen. No, we can't? Fine, you both get your own. And you go.
Split screen, yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
split screen, multiplayer, roguelike co-op. It's like, it's beautiful. It's so good. It's very hard as you get into it. And the roguelike randomization nature of it means you die, you're like, fuck it, let's go back, let's do it again.
I think the second game had that too, but I'm not positive on it being split screen though.
I could swear, I can't remember, because I also have memories of like, if you jump into the air, you will splat against the side of the screen and bounce back.
Oh yeah, you will. Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Because I think, yeah, even if one of you, Toe Jam or Earl, goes through a door, the other person has to also go through the door before the game can continue. Like you literally, it just kind of locks you into that screen until you figure it out.
Yep.
That game's a little rough. That one's a little rough. I think there's a reason easy mode only does the first 5 levels, and that's because after level 5, the game becomes kind of miserable.
Oh yeah.
I would actually list that on like not so good multiplayer games, because there's really difficult platforming segments that come in later on where you're like balancing on bubbles and trying to like get across long stretches of stuff, and if someone falls, I'm trying to remember which way it goes. Sometimes it'll like pull you both out of the platforming altogether. Other times it's just like, oh, they're gone for now, they'll figure it out later. It's super weird and clunky.
Yep.
Would you put it on the bad side then?
I'd probably put it on the bad side, yeah. I've got fond memories of the first like quarter of that game and really negative memories of everything else. It's a very hard game to 100% too if you want to get all the secrets.
Yep. What about you, Soan?
Well, I can't really think of any bad ones. Balls would be a really bad one. Shaq Fu, mentioned before, yeah. For good ones besides fighting games, I kind of enjoyed like Sonic 2 and Sonic 3 versus modes. Those were pretty fun. So they made it like really they kind of changed it up in the gameplay, but it was fun.
All right. So the next question comes from MMG Mike. What's your favorite and least favorite zones from any Sonic game on the Sega Genesis? Favorite for me is in Sonic 1, I'm gonna go with I'm more likely gonna go with either Spring Yard Zone or Starlight Zone. Sonic 2, I'm gonna go with Casino Nights. Sonic 3, I am gonna go with I'm actually gonna go with the Hydro City or Hydrocity, whatever you want to call it, or well, I'll go with Sonic 3. Sonic and Knuckles. I am gonna go with Sky Sanctuary. Least favorite zones for each of them. Sonic 1. I'm gonna go with Labyrinth Zone. Labyrinth Zone for Sonic 1.
Oh, you took mine. No, it's fine.
Fuck that zone.
Yeah.
Sonic 2, I'm gonna go with Oil Ocean. Sonic 3, I'm gonna go with no, I'm saving that for Sonic Knuckles. Sonic 3 itself, I'm gonna go with probably Marble Garden. It's not a bad zone, but of the Sonic 3 proper zones, it's probably the weakest one. But Sonic and Knuckles, Sandnopolis. Those are my least favorites. All right, Rick?
What about Sonic CD?
Oh, Sonic CD. Okay. Favorite in that one, is probably Stardust Speedway, and least favorite is Wacky Workbench.
I feel like you just unlocked a core memory. I was literally trying to remember what I had 5 of the zones in my head, and then was like, "What the hell is the other?" Oh god.
Yeah. So
All right, I'll guess I'll go next with worst and best. Okay, worst starting would be for Sonic 1 would be Labyrinth Zone. I completely agree with that.
yeah,
Sonic 2, that's a little tougher. They're not Oil Ocean. I agree with that one. Okay.
yeah,
Sonic 3 would be not too. Oh yeah, Sandalopoulos. Never mind. Yep,
Snobless,
I
yeah.
agree with that. And Sonic CD Wacky Workbench. Yes. Now best. Let's see. Sonic 1 levels. I like Starlight. That's a good one. Sonic 2. I kind of really like Hip Top Zone. It's just unique. It's different, and does soundtrack for it is different. Sonic 3, possibly Hydro City or Hydrocity or however they pronounce it.
Yeah.
And Sonic CD, let's see, Stardust Speedway. Of course, yeah. That's my list.
All right. Rick?
Let's see. So I'm gonna do best and worst for each one at the same time. But like so,
Okay.
Sonic 1, I would say my favorite for Sonic 1. That actually might be the hardest one. I think I'd say Starlight Zone for Sonic 1. I think my worst are. I think we're like almost a uniform. Three of us on our worst. My least favorite is Labyrinth Zone. It's just a pain in the ass. Including, I'm gonna even include Scrap Brain Zone Act 3 in that list.
Yeah,
if you miss the skip, it's just fucking torture.
Yeah.
Last
Sonic.
bubble.
Oh my god. Yeah, seriously. Oh my god. Sonic 2, I'd say my favorite is probably split between Chemical Plant Zone and Mystic Cave Zone. Worst is Oil Ocean by like a mile. The one thing that makes it even a little bearable is that in chunks of the two acts, you can go under the scaffolding in the oil, and the death plane is a little below that, so you can skip large portions of the level if you're careful with your button presses. And I do that all the time because I fucking hate it. It's the goddamn seahorses. They just shoot at the absolute worst imaginable moment in the middle of your jump. Jesus Christ.
Especially when you're trying to get all the rings, and the moment you have 50 rings, you're about to jump to...
It gets you in the middle of the jump.
Yeah.
Shout out, by the way, to every enemy in Metropolis Zone that have completely busted ass hitboxes.
Yeah.
There's literally like someone's actually done like a Smash Brothers style. Here's where the hitbox and hurtbox is on these guys, and the fucking like Bullet Crab, his claw hitbox goes past him to the back even after it started to extend. Like there are literally moments where it's completely impossible to damage them, even though there's no reason for that.
Yeah.
But anyway, Sonic CD, is kind of, it's a little tougher on that one. It's almost like a split between the good levels, the bad levels. Palm Tree Panic is good. Collision Chaos is good. I'd say Metallic Madness might actually be my favorite, just because it's weird and difficult, but it's not like insane. Stardust Speedway is the one that's like right in the middle for me. Tidal Tempest is not so good. And Wacky Workbench is like so obviously the shittest, might be the worst of the whole Genesis CD chunk altogether. It's terrible.
It is very, very bad.
So bad. Doing the bonus things they added in Sonic Origins with that was also a terrible time.
Yep.
Sonic 3, I would say my favorite is probably also Hydra City. I kind of like Launch Base also. Worst one there would be Marble Garden. Also not that bad in my opinion, but it's definitely the least good of the 6.
Yeah.
Including, I don't know, it's just like there's so much stuff that makes you wait in Marble Garden. You're on the little spinny thing, you got to do this thing. It's like, yeah, okay. Or, oh, things are collapsing, but you made it there fast. You're sitting there waiting. Those ones are a little rough. Sonic and Knuckles, best, I would say, I really like Flying Battery Zone.
Oh, yeah.
And I really like Lava
mention
Reef
that.
Zone.
Lava Reef sounds great.
Those two are definitely my favorites there. Worst is easily Sandopolis. It's like all the worst parts of Sonic 1, 2, and 3's offerings of bad zones put together. God help you, because by that point you probably have Supersonic or whoever, and you're like, sick, I can fly through this level, but there's so many spots you get pinched because Supersonic is technically a couple pixels taller than regular Sonic, and that will fuck you up. There's a bunch of just crushing things. There's the sand you're sitting through. There's the ghosts in Act 2, and maybe the most annoying, it's not even like the mini boss is annoying because you just sit and wait, but those swings that go on in Act 1, where it's like you hit one and you're just like, how fast can I hit the button to just kick off the side, just get me out of here, please. You can't jump off of it. It's just a huge time waste. So yeah, Sandopolis, definitely the worst of Sonic and Knuckles.
Yeah. Next question is from Professor Icepick. Do you think it's weird that most people call it the Genesis, even though it's called the Mega Drive pretty much everywhere else, and it did the best in Europe? No, not at all. I don't think it's weird at all. I think because I did not really hear the name Mega Drive until later, because I was so used to calling it Genesis for so many years. So I don't really think it's weird.
The only thing about that was the Sega CD was the Mega CD. I think Sega CD sounds better than Mega CD, but Mega Drive as a name is pretty good.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to kind of look at that era of games because it was so common for there to be localized names for things. The Famicom, the what was TurboGrafx one? This
PC Engine.
Yes, the PC Engine. Thank you.
Oh,
a whole bunch of just like, in some cases, like the PC Engine, you would, unless you knew better, you'd have no way of knowing it was related to anything else at all. But like right around like 95, everybody stopped doing that simultaneously. Like every name was the same in every country after that. I think the Sega CD might have been the last one to do it. I forget which one came first between the TurboGrafx and the Sega CD, but I think the Sega CD was the last one to have like a localized name like that. It's weird in hindsight. Looking at it 30 years later, it's weird looking back because we're so used to everything just having like a global universal name. But it was so common in the 80s and 90s. And it feels like two separate eras, really. Like back in the day, because nowadays we're like, oh, sick, Dragon Quest X offline, maybe that'll get localized to the US. And it's like, back then there was none of that. There was no, you got the games you got the consoles you got, and you were like, sick. You probably don't even know about the exclusives that are going on in other countries in the first place. Like, you just don't hear about them. Even in, like, Nintendo Power, you're not going to hear about... I don't know if Nintendo Power in the US ever spoke about Mother 3, just as an example. Like, they might have offhandedly from, like, a mail-in thing, it might have come up. But, like, in the same way, when it came to the consoles and their names and their identities in all these different countries, like, it was, pre-social media era. I think it was still like pre-instant messaging era for the most part. Like, you just didn't have a lot of ways to know that was what the case even was in the first place.
Yeah.
And yeah, so like it really. Oh yeah, that's right. Earthbound 64. Yes, that was. I guess that's true. Yeah, it became a canceled game, and then quietly just kind of faded away in the States like that. Well, Japan was like, oh, we're getting on the Game Boy Advance. Hell yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Outside the
yeah.
Sega one, Nintendo had Famicom and Super Nintendo. So
Yeah, Famicom, Super Famicom. Game Boy was the same everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But like those were the only two Nintendo had that were like Japan only. Like Master System was the
yeah,
same everywhere, but um, the Mega Drive was its own thing outside of North America. Like, I mean, we were the only ones that were different. Like we had the Genesis, everyone else had Mega Drive. Um, like PlayStation 1, N64, and Saturn were like the only one, like were like the start of where like everything was consistent worldwide. It was not different. Um, but yeah, it wasn't weird at all. No.
In some ways, I wonder if like Sega's huge mishandling of the 32X and the Saturn kind of wisened people up a little bit to like, hey, we got to focus more on how we work as a company and like a team globally. Like if we start it, like I'm sure that the other companies, Nintendo, Sony was just starting to get their stuff together for the PlayStation then as well. Like they probably looked at that and they were like, hey, having all these like disparate parts of our company that kind of operate on their own or market on their own maybe isn't such a good idea. Maybe we kind of bring everything under one banner from now on. Because like right around that time, it just stopped completely. We never got different names ever again
Yep.
for the hardware. Software we still do, obviously, but not for the
super
hardware.
good point.
Let's see. So the next question comes from Respectable Fool. What's the most obscure Sega Genesis title you've played, enjoyed, and can recommend to others? We pretty much already answered that when Mr. Ben asked that, but I'll give a different answer than Dynamite Heady. This is also on Super Nintendo, but I played this and beaten this game on Sega Genesis. Cool Spot. So,
Yep.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
so Cool Spot is a game where you play as that Spot, who for a while was a mascot for the 7-Up brand, like the 7-Up sodas. At that time, like it was just basically like the Spot with the sunglasses, and they made a game based off of him. It was on Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo. That game was fun. Very underrated game. It was actually pretty good for what it was. They made a sequel, Spot Goes to Hollywood, which wasn't as good as Cool Spot. But Cool Spot is what I recommend.
Trying to think of one that I would say two that come to mind pretty quickly would be either Light Crusader or we mentioned it earlier, but Michael Jackson's Moonwalker is actually a pretty decent game on the Genesis.
Yeah.
It is unhinged, but it is actually pretty fun.
Yeah.
So I would shout it out to that.
I'm gonna repeat Fatal Labyrinth.
Yeah. Okay. How would you rate the physical Sega Genesis controllers versus other contemporaries examples? Personally speaking, I think the 6-button controller is the best version of that controller because 3 buttons for some games it's not enough. Like
Yeah.
if you're gonna play Street Fighter, you need a 6-button controller. They made a 6-button controller so that you could play Street Fighter 2 on the Sega Genesis. That was the way they did it. But that being said, I like the 6-button layout. I like the layout that Sega Genesis had. I still prefer the Super Nintendo controller over it.
I would say that the 3 contemporary controllers of the mid 90s would go Super Nintendo up top, the Genesis, either the 3 or 6 button, really, in terms of just like ergonomics and just like how useful it was. And then the TurboGrafx, I was never a fan of that controller, like at all.
Yeah, same.
I think I prefer the Sega Saturn controller over the Genesis one. I think that's the best D-pad compared to it.
Okay.
Was that the big circly one?
There was two.
Yeah.
There was.
Yeah, and it was great on fighting games. Like, oh my god.
Yep. Let's see. So, the last question comes from 3-Up Moon. What was the very first game that you ever played on Sega Genesis? Your first introduction to the console? I pretty much answered that by saying that there was some sort of boat game that I don't remember the name of it. So, that's basically it.
I'm pretty sure it was Sonic 1 for me, though that easily would have been because it was just a pack-in title at the time. But that was probably the one that I played the most when I first got it as well. Great introduction to the system for sure.
Yeah.
Trying to remember which Sonic game. It was a Sonic game. I don't think it was Sonic Spinball because even though I got it for my birthday, I did play. Yeah, it was Sonic 1. Yep, it was Sonic 1. I was playing it with at a friend's house. That was an introduction.
All right.
Nice.
And that right there is all the questions for the community questions that we have. So that's going to do it for this podcast. So I want to thank the both of you for being a part of this. So Rick, Soan, I appreciate you guys.
Yeah,
I
thanks
appreciate
for
this too. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yep. Before we sign off, Rick, where can we find you?
You can find us mostly on YouTube, youtube.com/ @the_dpad, because they got to make it nice and complicated.
Mm-hmm.
I think youtube.com/ dpadfm also still works. If you go to dpad.fm, I have that redirect to our YouTube channel. Yeah, we've got just an absurd number. We've got over 900 games that we've played on the channel to some degree or another, and we're always playing more. So hope to see some of you guys over there.
All right. Awesome.
We're currently playing Eiji Aonuma's first, his directorial debut, Marvelous Another Treasure Island. Again, that took a lot of inspiration from A Link to the Past, and then wound up inspiring Triforce Heroes later on.
Oh, wow. That's actually amazing to even hear about that. So where can we find you?
Well, you can find me on Twitch at Soan, S0AN. I play Sega Genesis games on Mondays, 7 p.m. CT, and Fridays I do whatever. Also 7 p.m. CT around this time while we're doing the stream. And that's about it.
Yep. And as always, you can find me on pretty much any type of social media that you could think of. Twitch, Twitter, or like YouTube, Instagram, Discord, you name it. I'm pretty much on it. And I stream daily Monday through Thursdays from 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. Eastern until midnight, with the occasional Sunday stream and the very rare Friday stream. So the next episode is going to take place on Monday, and that right there is going to be the Super Nintendo. And the guests for that one are going to be Zykrul, Mr. Ben, and Retro Raji. We're going to have a great discussion on the Super Nintendo. And we have one more episode for the spring seasons of Sharing with Shellshock. That's going to happen on June 16th. At 8 p.m. Eastern, and that one is going to be about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And the guests for that one, I have Zenspath, it's the Rocketeer, and Kurt Dog. That one's going to be a good one too. So that's the 16th. June 10th is going to be Super Nintendo, and then after that we'll be on break until September. So, yeah,
These guys got to pick which colors you're going to wear for the Ninja Turtles.
Oh,
Get yourself the bandana with the eye holes.
Yep. I'm gonna go send the raid over to Just the Mess Games. Alright, so with that in mind, the next episode is on Monday. I hope you guys can tune in for that. That one is gonna be incredible, like talking about the Super Nintendo, which, just like the Sega Genesis, also one of my favorite consoles of all time, and I have a lot to say on that too. So just one last thing I'll say again, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Soan. I appreciate it. That you guys came through to talk about the Genesis. And to everybody that came in, that's watching on Twitch, or to anyone that's going to be watching this on YouTube, make sure to take care of yourselves. Be awesome. Stay awesome. Tell your loved ones you love them. Check up on them as always. Fight for lasting peace. And I'll see you guys next time. And y'all have a wonderful night and have a great weekend. Bye.
See you later.